It was just after 7 in the evening, and the hills had started to walk. Not shake, not crack, walk, rolling toward the villages below like something out at sea, and the people who lived on them had no word for what was happening, because nothing like it had ever happened to them before. By the time the ground went still again, 250,000 people were gone, swallowed by earth that, an hour earlier, had been as solid as anything they knew. This is the story of December 16th, 1920, a date almost nobody outside China has heard of, attached to a disaster that killed more people than almost any earthquake in recorded history. And the strangest part isn't the death toll, it's how the ground itself managed to do something that, by every rule of physics we normally trust, dry soil simply should not be able to do. Let's start with the night itself, because the details matter. It was winter in Gansu province, in the far northwest of China. A full moon hung over hills already dusted with snow, and the temperature had dropped to around -15 degrees Celsius. Across the province, families were finishing dinner and settling in. Some were already settling in for the night. There was no warning, not because anyone failed to give one, but because no instrument on Earth, then or now, can predict an earthquake before it happens. One moment, an ordinary winter evening. The next, the single deadliest event to strike that stretch of the planet in centuries. What followed lasted about 10 minutes. 10 minutes that redrew the map of an entire region. A rupture tore through the Earth's crust for roughly 230 kilometers. For comparison, that's about the distance from Los Angeles to San Diego and back again. At the epicenter, the shaking hit the absolute top of the intensity scale used to measure earthquake damage. Degree 12 out of 12, the point at which the scale simply runs out of numbers. Across an area of roughly 20,000 square kilometers, a zone of total devastation. More than 50 towns and hundreds of villages effectively stopped existing. The tremor didn't stay local either. It rippled outward and was felt across the entire planet. We'll come back to exactly how far, because that detail turns out to be one of the strangest threads in this whole story. But nothing that happened anywhere else compares to what happened inside the epicenter itself. Whole hillsides didn't just collapse, they moved. Entire slopes slid down valleys carrying houses, courtyards, and the people inside them, like rafts on a wave. And here's the part that's hard to wrap your head around. For some people, that ride saved their lives. Houses traveled nearly 1 kilometer downhill and came to rest still standing, upright, intact, with the cooking fire still burning in the hearth, as if someone had carefully picked the whole building up and set it down somewhere new. Other people, sometimes their own neighbors, simply vanished into the ground. The line between surviving and not surviving wasn't decided by luck in any way we'd recognize. It was decided by geology, deep underground, in a fraction of a second, long before anyone on the surface felt a thing. We build our entire lives on one assumption, that the ground holds still. Every foundation ever poured, every wall ever raised, starts from that premise. For 10 minutes in December 1920, in this one corner of China, that premise simply stopped being true. The Earth behaved like an ocean, with waves, currents, even depth. And here's a fact that should bother you a little. This is the second deadliest natural disaster of the entire 20th century, and it barely made it into the newspapers of its own era. Historians who later went looking for records in the archives of northwest China found half-empty shelves, an event that permanently reshaped the landscape of an entire region, left behind less paperwork than a bad city fire somewhere else in the world. There's a reason for that silence, and we'll get to it. It isn't a mystery. It's almost worse than a mystery, because it's completely explainable. But to understand any of this, why the ground moved like water, why homes that had been trusted for millennia became death traps in minutes, why some people were carried gently to safety while others a few meters away were erased, we first need to understand something most people never think about: what these hills were actually made of, and where the people who died were actually living. Because they weren't just living on the land. In a very real sense, they were living inside it. Northern China sits on top of the largest deposit of a material called loess anywhere on the planet. Loess is essentially ancient wind-blown dust. Fine silt carried out of deserts by wind during the ice ages and laid down, year after year, for hundreds of thousands of years, until in places it had piled up hundreds of meters thick. No river built this landscape. The wind did, one dust storm at a time. Two things about this material matter enormously for what happens later in this story, so hold on to them. First, Los is almost half-empty space. Nearly 50% of its volume is just air, trapped between grains of dust. Second, it isn't afraid of weight so much as it's afraid of vibration. You can carve straight down into a Loess hillside with nothing more than a spade, and the wall you cut will stand there, vertical, solid, seemingly as sturdy as stone. To the people who first settled this region more than 4,000 years ago, that looked less like a hazard and more like an invitation. So they dug homes directly into the hillsides. These cave dwellings are called yaodong, and people in this part of China have been living in them for around 45 centuries. Step inside one in winter, and the hills essentially trade places with the seasons for you. Outside it might be -15 and windy, but behind the door, the packed earth holds a steady, even warmth. Walls tens of meters thick block out almost every sound from the outside world. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and dry clay. In summer, the same thick earth keeps the heat out. No timber framing, no brick, just a door and a window cut into a wall of yellow earth, in a place where wood was, historically, more expensive than grain. It was, by any reasonable measure, a brilliant piece of vernacular engineering. It had worked flawlessly for 4,500 years, but there was one property of these homes that nobody, across all those centuries, had any reason to think about, because it had simply never come up. Every single one of these houses was built from exactly the same material that would, one December evening, turn into a wave. In the spring of 1921, a geologist named Weng Wenhao led an expedition into the wrecked region, the first scientific field survey in the history of Chinese seismology. He walked from county to county, cataloguing things that didn't fit any picture he'd carried with him into the field. Villages hadn't disappeared under piles of rubble, the way they normally do after an earthquake. They had disappeared under hills, entire slopes that had held roofs over people's heads for 45 centuries, had shifted as single solid masses, taking everything inside and on top of them along for the ride. Where valleys used to run, new ridges now stood. Where ridges used to stand, there were now craters. His maps of these shifts became the first seismological documents ever produced in China. He noted something else that didn't add up too: rivers. Several rivers in the region simply stopped flowing. No water reached the lower valleys. Not the next day. Not the following week. As if someone had dammed the entire channel overnight. His expedition logged it as an unsolved mystery. The answer would come later, and it would turn out to be stranger than anyone guessed at the time. Here's a detail that's easy to skim past, but that changes everything about why this disaster killed so many people. A yaodong doesn't fail the way a normal building fails. There's no roof to collapse. Because there isn't really a roof in the conventional sense. There are no walls to buckle, because the walls are the hillside itself. The entire structure depends on exactly one condition holding true. The surrounding earth has to keep behaving like a solid. For 4,500 years it did. On the evening of December 16th, 1920, that condition was switched off. To understand how, we need to go underground, down to where, for millions of years. Two enormous pieces of the Earth's crust had been slowly grinding against each other, storing up energy. Beneath the Loess Plateau runs a fault of genuinely planetary scale, the Haiyuan fault, the boundary where the Tibetan Plateau presses against a much older, more rigid block of crust called the Ordos Block. India is drifting into Asia at roughly the speed your fingernails grow, imperceptible day to day, unstoppable over geological time. That collision pushes Tibet outward, sideways. And all of that accumulated force eventually has to go somewhere. It goes into northwest China. For centuries, the fault had been quietly storing that stress. the way you might slowly bend a stick further and further, waiting for the moment it finally snaps. By December 1920, the stick was about as bent as it was going to get. On the evening of the 16th, it snapped, and the failure ran like a chain reaction. One segment of the fault gave way and dumped its load onto the segment next to it. That one failed too and passed the stress along again. The rupture raced across the land the way a crack races across glass, at a speed of several kilometers per second. On either side of the fault, the ground shifted relative to itself by several meters, within a span of minutes. Survivors later described the main shaking as lasting around 10 minutes. Not one single jolt, but a series of waves, arriving one after another. Where the rupture reached the surface, it sliced through fields, leaving fresh cliffs of raw earth and shoved roads sideways, as if someone had physically dragged half the landscape a few meters to the left. What survivors remembered most wasn't even the shaking itself, it was the sound. First, a low rumble from underground, deep, steady, building, as if an invisible train were picking up speed somewhere beneath the hills. Then the rumble turned into motion, and the moonlit night vanished behind a wall of dust, so thick that the moon disappeared from the sky until morning. A British missionary named George Findlay Andrew, who was working in Gansu at the time, spent the aftermath collecting survivor accounts for regional relief reports. What struck him was how consistent the stories were. People from villages that had no contact with each other, no way to have compared notes, described the exact same thing. The ground beneath their feet moved in waves, the way water moves under a boat, and there was simply no way to stay standing on it. How powerful was the quake exactly? That question still doesn't have one clean answer. The United States Geological Survey puts the magnitude at 7.8. China's own seismological authority puts it closer to 8.5. That gap isn't a scientific disagreement, so much as a historical accident. China had no seismic monitoring network of its own at the time. The first stations wouldn't be built for decades. The strength of the quake had to be reconstructed, after the fact, using instruments thousands of kilometers away. The death toll has the same problem. Conservative estimates put it around 200,000. Chinese research puts the number as high as 273,000. Nobody will ever know the true figure more precisely than that. And later in this story, you'll understand exactly why. But here's something that doesn't add up on the surface, and it's the key to this entire disaster. Powerful earthquakes had struck China before, and they'd killed tens of thousands of people, not hundreds of thousands. Lanzhou, the provincial capital, sat squarely inside the destruction zone, and for the most part, it survived. Its brick and timber buildings bent, cracked, groaned, but held. Meanwhile, in the surrounding rural counties, entire valleys simply ceased to exist. The shaking itself wasn't what killed most people. What killed them was what that shaking did to the specific yellow earth their homes were carved into. Brick cracks, Loess moves. That difference is what a pair of journalists went looking for a year and a half later. In the summer of 1922, National Geographic correspondents Upton Close and Elsie McCormick reached the disaster zone and titled their eventual report with the phrase survivors kept using themselves. Where the mountains walked, not where the ground shook, where the mountains walked. Their account remains the primary Western record of the disaster. Getting there wasn't easy. The railway ended long before the destruction zone began, and from there the only routes were caravan trails, many of them freshly sliced through by new landslides. What they found had no real name yet. These weren't ordinary landslides, where loose material slumps down a slope. Entire hillsides had torn free as single masses and flowed, for kilometers, across flat ground, and even up the far side of opposing hills, moving too fast for anyone caught in the path to escape, and stopping just as suddenly as they'd started. The combined area of collapsed slopes covered hundreds of square kilometers. On top of some of these flows, houses had gone along for the ride, and some arrived intact, fire still burning in the hearth, dishes still sitting on the shelves. Their owners walked outside the next morning and recognized nothing around them. The house was still standing. It just wasn't where it used to be. The photographs Close and McCormick brought back are some of the only visual records of the disaster that exist. In them, the hillsides look like ocean waves caught frozen at the exact moment they crash into shore. There's really no better description than the one the survivors themselves settled on. The mountains walked. By morning, the valleys looked foreign. Where windows had glowed with lamplight the night before, there was now a smooth yellow slope. Roads ran straight into hills that hadn't existed on any map the day before. From horizon to horizon, not a single chimney was smoking. Wells, courtyards, terraced fields, all of it buried under tens of meters of earth. What remained was silence, broken only by wind. And that silence turned out to be the closest thing this disaster ever got to a census of its dead. A century later, researchers went back and tried to properly count what had happened. In 2020, a team of geologists led by Yue and Ren Xu reconstructed the event using archival reports, field surveys, and satellite imagery. Their catalogue is staggering, more than 7,000 individual landslides. The single biggest cause of death, their study concluded, was the collapse of homes dug directly into the loess. Roughly another 32,000 people were killed directly by the landslides themselves. And buried in their data was a line that finally solved the mystery of those rivers that had stopped flowing decades earlier. Landslides had dammed valleys in 126 separate locations. Water that used to flow downhill now had nowhere to go, and behind these accidental earthen dams, lakes began forming that nobody had built and nobody had asked for. More than 50 of them are still there today, holding water. That still left the biggest unanswered question of all, the one no catalogue, no field report ever fully explained. Dry earth isn't supposed to flow. There's no water present to liquefy the ground, the way there is in the kind of soil failure engineers usually study after coastal or riverside earthquakes. It was December. The loess was frozen solid enough to ring when struck with a pickaxe. So why did these hills behave like a liquid? The answer turned out to be buried in the very structure of the dust itself, and it explains why this disaster had, in a sense, been built into these hills from the moment the very first Yaodong was ever carved. Loess holds together using an architecture that essentially no other type of rock or soil relies on. Every particle in it settled out of the air individually and landed wherever it happened to land, more or less at random, the way snowflakes pile up in a fresh drift. Between those particles are countless tiny pockets of open space. Nearly half the total volume of the material is empty air. What holds this airy structure together at all are microscopically thin mineral bridges, bonds of calcium carbonate that slowly grow between grains over thousands of years. The result is a rigid framework. It holds up a vertical cliff face. It holds up the roof of a cave. It holds up the entire weight of a hill, right up until that framework breaks. A seismic wave doesn't break those bridges one at a time. It shatters billions of them simultaneously. The whole internal skeleton disappears within seconds, and the moment it does, the material stops behaving like solid ground at all. The individual grains, suddenly free of anything holding them in place, start behaving like a fluid. Geologists call this dry liquefaction. And unlike the liquefaction most people have heard of, water plays no role in it whatsoever. Its role is played by air that had been trapped inside the pore spaces of the loess for millennia. That same mechanism explains the strangest feature of the Haiyuan landslides, how they travelled so far. As the collapsing hillside slid, they rode on a cushion of that same trapped air, moving with almost no friction, which is exactly why they could travel for kilometers from where they started, climb up and over opposing slopes, and carry entire houses along essentially undamaged. A hillside, once its internal structure failed, stopped behaving like a mountain and started behaving like an avalanche. And it obeyed the physics of an avalanche, not the physics of solid rock. Scientists can now reproduce this exact failure on shake tables in the lab. A column of dry loess holds its shape under a static load. Then the table starts to vibrate, and the material visibly collapses in on itself, losing up to a third of its original height, the way a soufflé collapses the instant you touch it. Lab tests on loess samples taken from this exact region produced a number that puts the whole disaster into perspective. The internal structure of this material starts to fail at an acceleration of less than a tenth of the force of gravity. That's roughly the level of shaking a person could comfortably stand through without losing their footing. A jolt gentle enough that dishes wouldn't even slide off a table. The hills of Haiyuan experienced shaking many times stronger than that threshold, and not for a single instant but continuously for 10 full minutes. The material never stood a chance. Neither did the people who had built their entire lives inside it. That same night, the rest of the planet found out exactly how powerful this earthquake really was. Seismic waves circled the globe multiple times and were recorded by 96 observatories scattered across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. In Norway, roughly 7,000 kilometers from the epicenter, water in 3 fjords and 2 mountain lakes began rocking back and forth, slowly, with no wind and no visible cause. The planet was ringing like a bell that had just been struck. And for the first few days, that faint, distant ringing was essentially the only news of this disaster that reached the outside world. Instruments could register the shaking. They couldn't tell anyone what was happening to the people trapped beneath the hills. Buried in Weng Wenhao's original expedition report is an observation almost nobody read closely at the time. Landslides had occurred even in places where the shaking itself had been relatively weak, far out on the fringes of the affected zone, hundreds of kilometers from the fault line. This material didn't need a massive jolt to fail. It just needed vibration, almost any vibration. In 1921, that finding carried an implication that essentially nobody was in a position to hear. A disaster of this scale doesn't require a catastrophically strong earthquake at all. It just requires the wrong ground. And there was nobody positioned to hear it, because the country where all of this had just happened was consumed by something else entirely. The first night after the quake was clear and windless, minus 15 degrees. Hundreds of thousands of people were now stranded outdoors in the middle of winter Sui, with their homes either buried or reduced to rubble slopes Sui. There was nothing left to dig with. Sui, whatever tools people owned, had been buried along with everything else. Sui. Survivors burned whatever they could find Sui, and counted the aftershocks as the ground kept trembling, sway, each new jolt bringing down whatever had somehow, miraculously, still been standing. Sui. Aftershocks continued for another 3 years. Sway. 7 years after the main quake, the exact same fault ruptured again, further west near Gulan County, Sui, killing more than 40,000 people, in the same way, on the same kind of ground, Sui. Hillsides sliding, rivers dammed, valleys reshaped. Bay. Survivors of that second quake described it in the same words their parents' generation had used for the first one. Sui. The mountains walked. Help, when it came slowly. Sui. Telegraph lines were down. Roads dead-ended into fresh landslides. Sui. The nearest railway stopped hundreds of kilometers short of the worst-hit counties. Sui. But geography wasn't even the biggest obstacle. It was 1920. Sui. China's central government had effectively fractured into territories controlled by rival warlords, Sui, whose armies were busy fighting each other, and the country simply had no functioning apparatus, Sui, and no money to mount a rescue operation in a remote corner of the northwest. Sui. What aid did arrive? Grain caravans, missionary field hospitals, funds from international relief committees. Sui took weeks to reach individual counties. The winter cold moved faster than any of it, Sui. Making matters worse, the exact same month saw northern China gripped by a devastating famine. Sui. Drought had wiped out harvests across entire provinces, and virtually every caravan, every yuan of relief funding, Sui, every scrap of national attention was already being funneled there. Sui. The earthquake simply got in line behind the famine, and it was a very long line, pues. By the time meaningful help reached Haiyuan County, researchers estimate the area had already lost roughly half its population. Misen. What happened next is, in some ways, the second disaster buried inside this story. A quiet one. Sui. The rest of the world was looking somewhere else entirely. Europe was still tallying the losses of the First World War. Sui. China itself was consumed with the toll of its own civil conflicts. Wei. Historian Pierre Fuller, who later studied this event in depth, went looking through the archives of the northwestern provinces, Sui, and found them nearly empty. Scattered local chronicles, fragments of newspaper coverage, Sui, a handful of missionary letters. The second deadliest natural disaster of the entire 20th century, Sui, never produced a formal government commission, never generated a final report, Sui, never compiled a complete list of the dead, Fai. That 70,000 person gap between the low and high casualty estimates isn't really a scientific disagreement, Sui. It's the fingerprint of an era that simply didn't have the capacity to count, Sui, and so a catastrophe on a genuinely global scale quietly shrank down into a regional memory, Sui, a story told inside one county and almost nowhere beyond it. The dead here weren't buried in any conventional sense. The earth did that itself. In 10 minutes, Sui, at a depth no shovel could ever reach, Sui. Survivors marked new hillsides where they remembered a gate once standing or a street once beginning, Sui. Those markers rotted away within a few winters. The hillsides stayed, Sui. No headstones, no fences, no names. Just a ridge of earth where, the day before, there hadn't been one, Sui. And yet this disaster does have monuments. There are 126 of them, and some are large enough to be visible from space. Sui. In Ziji County, not far from the epicenter, sits a lake called Dangjiacha. Calm water framed by yellow slopes, Sui, reeds along the shoreline, birds passing through on migration, small fishing platforms extending out over the surface. Sui. No excavator dug this lake. No dam was engineered to fill it. It was created in 10 minutes, Sui, on one evening in December 1920, when a collapsing hillside sealed off a valley, Sui, and a river that had suddenly lost its path spent the next century quietly filling the basin behind it, Sui. Today it's the largest of the surviving quake lakes, and locals simply call it the Earthquake Lake. Sui. There are dozens like it scattered across the plateau, arguably the most honest memorials this disaster has. No inscriptions, no dates, no names carved anywhere. Sui, just water sitting where, by every reasonable expectation, there shouldn't be any water at all. Sui. It wasn't until the 100th anniversary of the disaster that Haiyuan County finally opened a museum, Sui, the first significant public act of remembrance in an entire century. While, before that, the only real record left of what happened was the landscape itself. The Haiyuan fault hasn't gone anywhere. Sui. Tibet is still pushing against the Ordos bloc, exactly as it has for millions of years, Sui, and modern instruments, satellite receivers, tilt meters, seismographs, are actively recording new strains, Sui, building up along that same seam in the earth, millimeter by millimeter, year after year, Sui. What was released in 1920 is quietly being replaced. Sui. The real question isn't whether another rupture will eventually happen. It's which segment of the fault it happens on, and when. Sui. The western section has already gone. That was the 1927 rupture near Gulang Sui. The central segment, the one directly responsible for 1920, has stayed silent ever since that December night. Sui. In seismology, a silence that long isn't reassuring. It's the opposite. Sui. And the ground above that fault hasn't changed either. It's still the same yellow dust, still held together by the same fragile framework. Sui. Neither has the way people live on top of it. Tens of millions of people still live across the Lowest Plateau today, Sui, and a substantial share of the rural population still lives in Yaodong, the exact same cave-style homes carved into hillsides. Sui. The newer ones now have reinforced concrete arches, stronger entrances, and building codes, so, written in direct response to what happened in 1920. But the underlying principle hasn't changed in 45 centuries. Sui. People are still living inside a material that, under the right conditions, can turn into liquid. Sui. There isn't really another option. For these hills, there never has been. And this isn't recklessness on anyone's part. Sui. It's an honest trade with the land. The same fertile dust that feeds people insulates their homes. Sui. And shelters them through brutal winters is the same material that, in one December evening, took 250,000 lives in 10 minutes. Sui. There's one thought from all of this that's hard to shake. We tend to divide the world into solid and liquid, Sui, land and water, and we build our entire understanding of stability on top of that division. Sui. Cities are built on the assumption of solid ground. Borders are drawn as if the earth beneath them will never move. Sui. Haiyuan is a reminder that this line is drawn in pencil, not ink. Sui. It only takes 10 minutes of the right kind of vibration to turn a hillside into a wave, a road into a riverbed, Sui, and a map into a historical document. The ground under our feet feels like the one thing we can always count on. Sui. The night of December 16, 1920 says otherwise. It wasn't solid ground at all. It was a pause between two movements. Sui. The first one ended more than a century ago. 270,000 people never left the place where it caught them, Sui. Nobody knows when the second one begins, Sui. The only thing anyone can say for certain is this. The ground is ready. It always has been, Sui.